Hey, it's Grim. I just want to very quickly talk about my upload schedule, that being I want to put out 1 to 2 videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So the link to the story I'm going to be reading will be in the description below, and on to the story. My morning that day started out in the same manner as all of my mornings have for the majority of my life. My alarm goes off at 6, I hit snooze a handful of times, and finally, with the help of my dog pawing at my face to go outside, I get out of bed at around 7. After I took the dog out, I did a small workout and some yoga for an hour per usual. With a Robert Johnson vinyl in the background, I go downstairs to make breakfast, singing along with the ominous versions of Hellhound on my trail as I make eggs. Although this routine has been a staple of mine, something felt off about the day to come. I didn't quite know what exactly felt off, but it was a strange sense that I couldn't seem to shake. That is when my phone rang. My impending sense of doom and unease that foreshadows a phone call with devastating news. Not quite, but who was on the other end of the call definitely did surprise me. It was my friend Scott's mother. Scott's mom never calls, so I picked up the phone in a hurry, worrying that something may have been wrong. To my pleasant surprise, everything was great. In fact, her and her husband were getting ready to leave for their annual out-of-state fishing trip. However, something was different this year. After a string of break-ins in their general area, Scott's parents decided to recruit me to stay at their house and watch over some things while they were gone. Plus, they needed someone to feed the animals since Scott wasn't around. They and Scott had quite a disagreement 3 months ago prior, and they hadn't spoken to him since. He decided to take what was called a much-needed trip out of town. Although I was apprehensive about staying alone in their old country home, I couldn't tell her no. Besides, someone had to feed the animals, and with Scott being out of town, I was the next best thing. Begrudgingly, I packed up my bags and headed out the door, taking my dog with me for some much-needed company. About 2 hours later, I pull into their driveway, the smell of manure assaulting the nostrils the second I open the door. The dog and I walk over to the barn to greet the animals, and it had been a long time since I'd been around them, so I was a little excited to see them again, even though I was still apprehensive about staying alone in that house. The first thing I noticed as I walked up to the barn was the smell. Not of manure this time, but of rot. I shrugged my shoulders and kept walking towards the barn, thinking to myself that a raccoon or an opossum had died. Gross, but these things happen on a farm. I continued to make my way over, trying not to gag from the stench that was very quickly becoming overwhelming. I was so distracted by the smell that I hadn't noticed that my dog, Butch, had stopped following me and was about 100 feet back. This struck me as odd because Butch had hardly ever left my side. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, since this was his first time on the farm and the smell must have been sending him into a sensory overload, I thought with a laugh. Finally, I reached the barn with my shirt over my nose to mask the stench. I slid the large door open. To my unwanted surprise, it wasn't a raccoon or an opossum as I had originally thought or hoped. Laying right in the middle of the barn was the severed head of a goat. To make matters worse, I followed the thick stream of blood up to the head, where I found that the goat was missing both of its eyes. And to make matters more odd, if that's possible, the head looked like it could have been there for days. Given that the blood was far past congealed and starting to soak into the dirt floor. However, Scott's parents had left that morning, so there's absolutely no way they could have missed that when feeding the animals before they left. I ran out of the barn and violently puked in the yard, where I noticed Butch was still a good 100 feet back, in the same spot where he had been when I walked in. I tried to call his name for some comfort after what I had just seen, but he wouldn't budge. He just sat there whining and shaking. After about 10 minutes of sitting in the grass, trying to put my thoughts back together on the horrors that I had just found, I gathered myself to go back in the barn to do a further investigation, to see if the other animals were still alive and well. Upon further investigation, I noticed that aside from the goat, the barn was still completely empty. I wanted to call Scott's parents, but being stuck in their old ways, they had refused to get cell phones and not left me any numbers to reach them. I managed to get a hold of Scott and told him what I had found. At first he thought I was messing with him, but I told him I would never make something like this up. The other end of the line grew silent. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Scott spoke up and told me to take the head out and bury it in the field before his parents got back. As for the other animals, he told me not to worry, as they were probably out in the pasture somewhere and would find their way back before nightfall. Not wanting to argue, I did as he said. During the cleanup process, I noticed that the body of the goat was nowhere to be found. I shrugged my shoulders, got a shovel, and carried the severed head into the field and made a shallow grave for it. I decided the best thing for me to do was to go into the house and relax a little. After all, I had been there for over an hour and Hadn't even got to step foot in the house. I grabbed my bag and dragged the reluctant Butch through the door. Already on edge, I jumped in fright as the screen door slammed shut behind me. As I walked into the house, the first thing that I noticed was the food on the counter. Baked potatoes scattered on the table, corn on the cob lying in a dish off to the side. Right in the center of the table was ham, sitting on a large plate with a dirty knife lying beside it. Out of confusion, I quickly walked up to the table to take a closer look at the food. By no means should there have been any food like that on the table. After all, I got the call from Scott's mother this morning saying that they were leaving. If that was the case, then why was this dinner from the previous night still sitting on the table? Were they truly in that much of a rush to get going? When I reached the table, I started to smell rotting food and noticed that the potatoes and corn were covered with white and green mold and the ham was covered in maggots. Suppressing my already irritated gag reflex, I turned away thinking about what to do next. I looked around the room, and that's when I noticed that Butch was gone. The last thing that I wanted right now was to be alone, so I desperately called out his name, searching the rooms for any sign of him. After about a minute of looking, I heard a whimper from the top of the stairs. Creeped out, but trying to find my dog, I headed towards the noise. With a large pit in my stomach, I slowly crept my way up the stairs where the whimpering was progressively getting louder. "Butch," I whispered, hoping to see his face peek around the corner, but I got no answer. As I finally reached the top of the stairs, I turned to my right, seeing Butch in front of Scott's parents' bedroom. The door was closed, and Butch was frantically scratching at it, scraping long slivers of white paint off the old wooden door with each swipe of his paw. Although every ounce of my body told me not to open that door, Butch's incessant whines and scratches told me that I probably should. My legs felt like they were made of iron as I slowly inched my way towards the door, practically dragging my feet with each step. I reached out and grabbed the old brass doorknob with sweaty hands and turned it. With a small push, the door slowly slid open with a creak. That's when I noticed the flies. Swarms of them were flying out the door as I slid it open. I reluctantly stepped inside, again noticing a terrible stench filling the air. I looked over to the bed, and that's where I saw two semi-mummified corpses laying side by side. I vomited in the corner of the room, just as I had done an hour ago by the barn, and leaned in to take a closer look. The mouths of the two corpses were gaping open as if in a perpetual scream, and their hair was matted to the pillows. The brown, leathery skin taut on their emasculated bodies. They looked like they had been dead for a good month, but I'm no forensic scientist, so I was going to leave that to the conclusion of the authority. I ran out of that room and down the stairs faster than I ever ran, my heart pumping so hard I thought it was going to explode. I grabbed Butch and ran out of the house with him to the car to call 911, as I couldn't stand to be in that place any longer. To my great relief, the cops arrived 15 minutes later. I explained the story in great detail, explaining that even the bodies were in my friend's parents' bed, but there's no way that could possibly be them. After all, I talked to his mom this morning. While talking to the police, I could see the bodies being transported in body bags to a large vehicle and shuddered. I called my friend, telling him everything. He was in utter shock and felt guilty for the 3-month absence that he had taken from his parents. About a week went by with no update when finally Scott called. Turns out the body had been his parents, and they were, in fact, estimated to have been dead for about a month. The news sent a cold shiver down my spine. Who had made dinner? I asked, incredulously. The food on the table, while odd, was definitely not a month old. He answered that the cops were not yet sure of that, but were finding out the answer. Then I asked if they had any leads on the goat's head, and he said that that was being investigated as well. He said that the cops informed him of several similar animal mutilation incidents around the area in the recent months, but have yet to have any leads on that as well. As the conversation came to the conclusion, I thought of one last thing to ask Scott before he hung up. If the bodies were truly his parents, then who had called me that night to come and watch the farm? Hey, it's Grim. I just wanted to quickly say thanks for listening, and if you liked it, to leave a like, and that would be awesome.